you're in the parliamentary lobby, and I think there's always a constant discussion of the lobby. Is it fit for purpose? Does the system work? This anonymous briefing system with quotes that can't be attributed to sources. What do you make of the system? Do you think it's a healthy system?
So it's much healthier than it. So I've done different. I've done business journalism, economics journalism, investigations, but I have had two chunks of my life when I was a political editor. So I was a political editor in the 90s for the FT, political editor now for ITV, and it is way healthier than it was in the 90s. To get back to the diversity issue, in the 90s, it was pretty much all men. I mean, there were one or two absolutely outstanding women political editors like Eleanor Goodman of Channel 4, but, they were very much a minority. Now, I guess that in the lobby it is 50-50 men and women, which is great. And it is the whole. It is much more transparent than it was. When I first joined, it was like joining the Freemasons. I mean, you had the sort of basic, the so-called lobby briefings, where twice a day you were briefed by the Prime Minister's spokesperson, and in those days there was a sort of weird room at the top of Parliament where it took place in, as well as taking place in Downing Street. And to go to my Freemasons point, actually, I wrote about this I recently published a thriller called The Whistleblower, which has a big chunk about what it was like to be working in the lobby in the 90s. And the room we used was actually the room that was reserved for Parliament's Freemasons. Believe it or not, you couldn't make it up. Anyway, we used it for lobby briefings. But you actually, when you joined the lobby, you sort of signed a sort of blood oath that you weren't even. Not only were you not allowed to source the information that you were given in these meetings, you were actually initially, you were not allowed to admit that these meetings took place. Even you were supposed to. If anybody asked you, you just had to deny that that we were being briefed in that way. Now, as we moved through the 90s, it all became a bit more transparent, and today's lobby briefings. We're allowed to record them. We do attribute what is said to the Prime Minister's official spokesperson. The question, but this is not just a question for the UK, it's actually a question for these arrangements in lots of countries, but, we are in the UK. The question is whether it is healthy to have particular cadre of journalists, in this case political journalists, in a sense sitting in one confined physical space, which we are at the top of a building in the Palace of Westminster, and whether that creates a groupthink that means that perhaps there's not enough competition that would be more challenging, to the government or the opposition, or to the way that we think about big political issues, whether it creates a little bit too much of a uniformity of view. Now, I would definitely have said that in the 90s, there was way too much of a herd instinct. I think there is now much more competition in imagination. Journalists do different things within the lobby. There is not this, slightly. In the old days, I'd say there was a slightly sort of sinister what's the word I'm thinking for? The journalists in the old days did cooperate too much in a sort of secretive way. So I think there was something wrong with the old system. I think, as I say, it is better than it was. The issues now, I think, are less around the political lobby and more around the way that individual prime ministers have attempted to influence newspapers. And so, it is well known that when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, he would regularly, ring up editors and encourage them to do things, occasionally shout at them. I was told one absolutely hilarious story the other day about, how there'd been a meeting in Downing Street about a story on the front page of a newspaper, which the communications secretary, said in the meeting, well, this is obviously wrong, we're going to have to correct it. And the Prime Minister piped up and said, oh, I'm awfully sorry I gave them that story. Now, this is sort of interesting territory, shall we say.
Yeah, definitely. And what I found interesting, I'm a journalist, I was not in the lobby, but pay close attention to Westminster, is I sometimes think, is the lobby, are individual members of the lobby too close to the government? In terms of, you have journalists who are godparents to the Prime Minister's children, which I think is how do those interpersonal relationships affect reporting?
So one of the things that is sort of striking about this country is how connected all sorts of people are in all sorts of different worlds. I mean, my own view is that, we all, sometimes we're aware of our prejudices, sometimes we're aware of our biases. I think the important thing, whether we're talking about journalism or about any other kind of important job where you're sort of influencing opinion, is, whatever interests one has need to be out there. People need to know your connections, as it were. And I think if people are aware of connections, then they can make their own judgments about whether or not what you're saying is impartial or fair or not. What would be sinister is if, and it does happen sometimes, there are close relationships which are sort of hidden. But I get back to my original point that so long as there are genuinely lots of different people competing with different points of views and different backgrounds, then you have a healthy media. If one felt that everybody was unhealthily close to this or that politician, then that's really bad for democracy, and we're sort of, too close to a sort of, and I don't think we are there, but then we are too close to the kind of system that we associate with, autocracies. And as I say, we're not there. And we're not there because I think we do have a system which, when there is a conflict of interest, mostly it's exposed.
Thanks very much for watching that video all the way to the end. And if you liked it, I've got some better news for you. PoliticsJOE is in the process of launching a podcast. Live in a couple of weeks' time. It's called The Pubcast. Link below, probably somewhere in the comments or the description, something like that. Check it out. Subscribe so you get ready for our first episode. It's coming soon. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, or any of those other slightly weirder platforms. See you soon.